The air inside the subway station was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of damp dirt, old metal, and the cheap coffee sold at the kiosk near the stairs. It was that specific time of the late afternoon when the city was transitioning from work to home, and the station was packed with people in a hurry. Thousands of feet shuffled across the dirty floor, creating a constant, dull roar of noise that echoed off the tiled walls. Everyone was moving with a single purpose: to get out, to get upstairs, to get away from the underground. Nobody looked at anyone else. In this place, making eye contact was a waste of time, and stopping for even a second meant getting pushed aside by the crowd. Right in the middle of this chaotic river of people stood a grand piano. It was a surprising sight to see such an elegant instrument in such a gritty place, but it was part of a city project. The idea was to bring art to the public spaces, to add a splash of color to the gray routine of commuting. Usually the piano sat ignored, serving as a resting spot for shopping bags or tired travelers. But today it had a player. Sitting on the bench was a man named Julian. He looked like he had seen better days. His trench coat was thick but looked worn at the edges, and his hair was messy from the wind blowing down the tunnels. He wasn't a street performer in the bright, happy sense. He didn't have a hat or a funny sign. He was just a man who loved music and, unfortunately, needed money. To the people rushing by, he was just another part of the scenery, like a trash can or a turnstile. But Julian had a secret that most of them didn't know. He wasn't just someone who had learned a few chords. He had spent years of his life in conservatories, training to be a concert pianist. Life, however, had a way of changing plans. Now, instead of playing in grand halls with velvet seats, he played here. Julian closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, filtering out the smell of the station, and let his fingers hover over the keys for just a moment. Then he began to play. He chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It was a piece that everyone knew, even if they didn't know the name. It started slow and sad, the heavy notes rolling out like deep waves in a dark ocean. The sound was clear and surprisingly loud, cutting through the noise of the trains screeching on the tracks above. For the first few seconds, the rushing crowd didn't react. They kept walking, their eyes fixed on the exit signs. But slowly, the music began to work its way into the air. It was a stark contrast to the ugly, mechanical sounds of the subway. It was human and emotional. Julian let himself get lost in the music. He wasn't thinking about the empty change case sitting on the piano, open and waiting for coins. He wasn't thinking about his cold apartment or the bills he couldn't pay. For these few minutes, he was back in a warm room, playing for people who actually wanted to listen. He hit the keys harder as the song grew more intense, his face tightening with emotion. He swayed slightly with the rhythm, his long fingers dancing across the ivory with a practiced ease that looked effortless. A few people slowed down as they passed. A woman in a business suit, typing furiously on her phone, paused for just a second. Her thumbs stopped moving. She looked up, actually seeing the piano and the man playing it, and for a brief moment the stress on her face softened. She didn't stop completely. She was late, but she threw a couple of coins into the open case before walking on. Clink, clink. The sound of money hitting the plastic was hollow, but Julian didn't open his eyes. He didn't play for the money, even though he needed it. He played because it was the only thing that made him feel like himself. The song moved into the quieter, more delicate middle section. The music became gentle, almost like a whisper. Julian's touch became lighter, caressing the keys instead of striking them. The station seemed to get a little quieter, or maybe it was just the illusion of the melody. The roar of the crowd was still there, but it felt further away now. Muffled by the beauty of the sound, he played on, pouring his loneliness and his fading hopes into every note. The subway station, usually so cold and impersonal, felt different around the piano. It became a small bubble of peace in a chaotic world. But still, Julian was alone. He was a solitary figure creating beauty in a place where beauty was usually ignored. He was used to this. He knew that in a city this big, a person playing a piano could be invisible if people tried hard. Enough to ignore him. Julian reached the end of the first movement. His hands hovered over the final chord. letting the silence hang in the air for a heartbeat before he brought his fingers down for the last, soft note. The sound faded away, disappearing into the high ceiling of the station. The silence didn't last long. Almost immediately, the noise of the rushing commuters rushed back in to fill the void, the announcement of the next train. The loud laughter of a group of teenagers, the heavy thud of boots on the floor. Julian let out a long sigh, his shoulders dropping as the tension of the performance left his body. He opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked down at the open case at his feet. A few dollar bills and some spare coins stared back at him. It wasn't much. It would buy a sandwich, maybe a coffee, but it wouldn't solve his problems. He flexed his fingers, feeling the slight stiffness in his joints. He was tired. It was exhausting to play with so much soul for people who didn't care. He thought about packing up, about taking the long walk back to his small, empty room. He sat there for a moment, just staring at the black and white keys, gathering the energy to start the next song or call it quits. He was invisible, just a ghost in a trench coat, and he was ready to accept that dot. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. The movement wasn't like the others. It wasn't a blur of someone rushing past. It was a figure that had stopped. Julian turned his head slightly, expecting to see a security officer telling him to move along, or perhaps someone who had dropped something. Instead, when he shifted his gaze, he saw a pair of small, worn-out sneakers standing right at the edge of the piano bench. They weren't moving. They were planted firmly on the dirty floor, waiting. Julian stopped rubbing his hands together. The boy had arrived. Julian blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog of his own thoughts. The figure standing there did not move. It was a young boy, barely 7 years old, standing perfectly still in a station where everyone else was running. He was a small thing, looking even smaller next to the large, imposing shape of the grand piano. The boy was dressed in a school uniform, a crisp white shirt and dark, gray trousers that looked slightly too short for his legs. His clothes were clean and neat, pressed carefully for the school day, but his shoes told a different story. They were scuffed, the leather peeling a little at the toes, and they were covered in the gray dust of the city streets. It was a clear sign of a family that was trying hard. A family that took pride in appearance even when money was tight. The river of commuters continued to flow around them. A businessman in a heavy overcoat brushed past the boy, nearly knocking him over without even saying, "Excuse me." Another woman, texting furiously on her phone, swerved at the last second to avoid a collision, her eyes never leaving the screen. The boy didn't seem to care about any of them. He had no interest in the trains, the crowd, or the destination signs. He only had eyes for the piano and the man sitting on the bench. Julian felt a familiar wave of irritation rise in his chest. This was the part of the job he hated the most. When he played, he wasn't just performing. He was begging in a way, open and exposed to the judgment of strangers. Most people ignored him, which was fine, but every now and then, someone would stop to harass him. Sometimes it was drunkards wanting to hear their favorite drinking song. Sometimes it was teenagers daring each other to mess with the hobo musician. And sometimes it was people who just wanted to mock him for playing classical music in a dirty subway station. He looked at the boy, expecting the worst. He expected the kid to make a funny face, or to bang on the keys, or to ask for money for candy. Julian prepared himself to be sharp and rude. He was ready to grab his sheet music and stand up, using his height to scare the kid away. He tightened his jaw, his fingers resting stiffly on the keys, ready to cut the interaction short before it began. "Hey, mister," the boy said. His voice was small, but it was surprisingly clear. He didn't shout, but he projected his voice well, a skill he probably learned in a noisy classroom. Julian didn't answer. He just raised an eyebrow, a silent, "What do you want?" Just then, a heavy train roared into the station on the tracks above them. The screeching of metal wheels on metal tracks was deafening. The floor vibrated under their feet. The noise filled the entire station, drowning out everything else. The boy had to lean in closer, shouting over the thunder of the train. He stepped right up to the curve of the piano, his hands still clasped behind his back, looking earnest. "I want to play." He shouted, his eyes wide and locked onto Julian's face. "Can I play a song?" Julian stared at him. Of all the things he expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. He let out a short, cynical laugh, a harsh sound that was swallowed by the noise of the train. He wanted to say, "No, go away." He wanted to say, "This isn't a toy." He looked at the boy's small, grubby hands and imagined them smashing against the delicate strings and hammers inside the piano. He imagined the discordant noise that would follow, the ruining of the atmosphere, the embarrassment of being the guy who let a kid ruin the music. He looked around at the passing crowd. A few people were glancing over now, intrigued by the sight of the old pianist and the small schoolboy. Julian felt a flush of heat on his neck. He felt put on the spot. If he said no, he would look like the villain, the grumpy old man who crushed a child's dream. If he said yes, he risked looking like a fool. It felt like a trap. The noise of the train began to fade as it pulled away, the whooshing sound dying down, leaving the station with that ringing silence that follows a loud noise. "A song?" Julian asked, his voice raspy. He leaned down slightly. "You want to play this?" "Yes, please," the boy said. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't bouncing up and down with excitement like most kids his age would be. He was dead serious. There was a heaviness in his eyes that made him look much older than 7. He looked at the piano the way a starving person looks at a loaf of bread. Julian studied him closer. There was a desperation there that caught Julian off guard. He saw himself in that look. He remembered being that age, remembering how badly he wanted to touch the keys of his aunt's piano, how he used to sneak into the room just to press one note and hear the sound vibrate through his body. He remembered being told that music wasn't for people like him, that it was for the rich kids, the kids with lessons and shiny instruments. He looked at the boy's worn sneakers again. He looked at the way the boy's fingers twitched slightly at his sides as if they were itching to reach out. "You know how to play?" Julian asked skeptically. He crossed his arms over his chest, creating a barrier. "Do you even know where the notes are?" The boy didn't brag. He didn't say, "I'm the best player in my class." He just nodded his head once. A simple, confident nod. "I know where they are," he said softly. Julian hesitated. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to pack up and leave. It told him that this was a waste of time, that the kid would bang out chopsticks and run away laughing. But there was something else, a feeling in his gut that he couldn't ignore. The boy's request wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank. It was a plea. The subway station was a cold, uncaring place. People stepped over each other to get ahead. Noise and dirt and gray concrete were everywhere. But right here, right now, there was a connection. A stranger asking for a moment of grace. Julian's shoulders slumped. The anger and irritation drained out of him, replaced by a sudden curiosity. He decided to take a chance. He decided to be the person he wished he had met when he was a hungry, lonely little kid. He looked at the boy's face, really looked at it, and for the first time that day, Julian's lips curled upward. It wasn't a fake smile for the crowd. It was a genuine, small smile of encouragement. It was a smile that said, "Okay, I'm listening. Show me what you've got." He slowly unfolded his arms and placed his hands on his knees, ready to stand. "Okay," Julian said, his voice gentle now. "Okay, you can play." The boy's eyes lit up, not with a wild excitement, but with a deep, quiet relief. It was as if Julian had just handed him the world. The pianist slid his heavy body off the bench, the wood creaking as he moved, and stood to the side, gesturing to the empty seat. The shock was about to begin, but neither of them knew it yet. Julian just thought he was being nice. He had no idea he was about to witness a miracle. The moment the decision was made, the atmosphere around the piano seemed to shift, though the rushing subway crowd barely noticed. Julian let out a long, weary breath, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, and prepared to surrender his spot. He wasn't doing this because he expected to hear greatness. He was doing it because the boy's eyes had a certain shine, a raw honesty that was hard to ignore. Julian figured he would let the kid bang out a few notes, laugh along with the crowd, and then go back to his own playing. It was a small act of charity. A moment of kindness in a hard day. Julian gripped the edge of the piano bench and slowly pushed himself up. His knees popped audibly, a reminder of his age and the long hours he spent sitting on this hard seat. He felt a sudden chill as he stepped away from the warmth of the instrument. The bench, now empty, looked strangely inviting. He gestured toward it with a wide, sweeping movement of his arm, like a butler opening a door for a king, though his smile was just a little bit crooked. "Go ahead," Julian said, his voice raspy but kind. "It's all yours. Don't break it, okay?" He added the last part as a joke, trying to keep things light. He expected the boy to giggle or scramble onto the bench with clumsy excitement. But the boy didn't laugh. He didn't scramble. He simply nodded, a very serious, solemn nod, as if accepting a great responsibility. He stepped forward, moving with a quiet grace that defied the chaos of the station. Getting onto the bench was a struggle in itself. The piano was built for adults, and the boy was tiny. He had to hop slightly, his hands gripping the wooden edge of the piano to pull himself up. Once he was seated, his feet dangled high above the floor. He couldn't reach the gold pedals at the bottom, the foot pedals that made the piano sound soft or sustained the notes. Anyone watching knew that without the pedals, the piano would sound dry and flat. It was another reason for Julian to think this would be a short, unimpressive performance. The boy shuffled forward on the leather bench. He had to sit on the very edge, his back straight, leaning forward to reach the keys. He looked so small against the massive black body of the instrument. To the commuters glancing over as they rushed to the escalators, it looked like a cute photo opportunity, a little kid playing pretend. A few people actually stopped, pulling out their phones, ready to record a funny video of a child making noise. They were smirking, their eyebrows raised in amusement. They were expecting chopsticks. They were expecting off-key bashing. They were waiting for a moment to laugh at the absurdity of a child in this serious, gray place. Julian crossed his arms over his chest and leaned his shoulder against the side of the piano. He positioned himself carefully. He was ready to step in. If the boy started hitting the keys too hard, or if he started acting silly, Julian was prepared to gently lift him down and send him on his way. He felt a protective instinct toward the instrument, but also a strange sense of curiosity. He wanted to see what this kid would do. The boy didn't immediately place his hands on the keys. Instead, he paused. He sat there for a long 10 seconds, staring at the black and white ivory. He took a deep breath, his small shoulders rising and falling. He seemed to be listening to something inside his own head, tuning out the screech of the arriving train and the loud announcements over the speaker system. He was entirely still, a statue of concentration. Julian watched the boy's face. The smile he had worn earlier was gone now. The boy's expression was fierce. His eyebrows were drawn together, his lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at the music he was about to play. Then the boy moved his hands. They were small hands, the fingers short and chubby, like a child's should be. But as he hovered them over the keys, they didn't tremble. They didn't waver. They hovered with absolute precision. He placed his right hand down first, fingers curved perfectly, touching the middle of the keys just like a professional would. Then, his left hand found its place lower down on the keyboard. Julian uncrossed his arms slightly. He noticed the hand position immediately. It was perfect. No random slapping, no flat palms. The boy's wrists were raised, his fingers arched. It was the posture of someone who had been taught, or someone who had watched very, very closely. The crowd that had gathered was growing restless. A man in a suit checked his watch, clearly thinking this was a waste of time. A teenager nudged her friend, whispering something that made them both giggle. The air was thick with skepticism. They were waiting for the joke to land. They were waiting for the noise. Julian looked at the boy's feet, dangling uselessly above the pedals. He thought to himself, this is going to sound like a typewriter. Without the pedals to connect the notes, the piano always sounded staccato and choppy. But the boy didn't seem to care. He shifted his weight slightly on the bench, getting comfortable, and closed his eyes for just a split second. In that moment, Julian felt a prickle of something on the back of his neck. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sudden sense of anticipation. He realized that the boy wasn't nervous. The boy wasn't there to play a game. The energy radiating from the small figure was intense and focused. It was the same energy Julian felt before a difficult performance. The feeling of the world narrowing down to just the tips of your fingers. The station noise seemed to fade into the background for Julian. The rushing people became a blur. The only thing in focus was those small, poised hands over the keys. He waited, holding his own breath without realizing it. "Okay," Julian whispered under his breath, more to himself than the boy. "Let's see what you have." The boy's fingers tensed. He was ready. The crowd held their collective breath, half expecting a childish tune. Julian stood ready to intercept. But nobody in that subway station was prepared for what was about to happen. The boy was about to shatter every single one of their expectations with just 10 fingers. The shock was only a heartbeat away. The moment the boy's fingers touched the ivory keys, the world of the subway station seemed to tilt on its axis. There was no clumsy fumbling, no tentative plinking of single notes to find the right pitch. Instead, the boy's hands descended with the confidence of a master. He struck a chord that was rich and complex, a sound that seemed to vibrate right through the wooden floorboards and into the solace of the onlookers' feet. It wasn't the happy, simple sound of a nursery rhyme. It was a deep, soulful jazz chord, the kind that usually comes from a smoky nightclub or a grand concert hall. Not from a 7-year-old boy in a dusty subway station. The shock hit Julian instantly. His eyes widened and the bored, protective stance he had been holding collapsed. He uncrossed his arms and took a sharp step closer to the piano, as if he needed to verify with his own eyes what his ears were telling him. The boy wasn't just hitting keys. He was playing without a moment's hesitation. The boy's right hand began to dance across the upper register while his left hand maintained a steady, driving rhythm on the lower notes. It was an improvisation, a flowing stream of music that twisted and turned with incredible speed and accuracy. The sound was sharp and percussive because, of course, his feet couldn't reach the pedals to soften the tone, but the lack of pedal didn't hurt the music. Instead, it gave it a raw, energetic beat, like a rapid heartbeat that everyone in the station could feel in their chests. The crowd, which had been smirking just seconds before, froze. The man in the suit who had been checking his watch stopped mid-motion. The teenagers who were giggling snapped their mouths shut. The ripple effect was visible. One person stopped, then another, and then another. Within seconds, the fast-moving river of commuters had slowed to a trickle. A large circle began to form around the piano, consisting of people who had abandoned their rush to witness this impossible sight. Julian watched the boy's hands closely. He saw things that shouldn't have been possible for a child. The boy's fingers were independent, his thumb doing one rhythm while his pinky did another, his left hand crossing over his right hand to hit a bass note in the middle of a run. It was a technique that took professional players years of grueling practice to master. Yet this boy was doing it naturally, his face relaxed, his breathing steady. He wasn't struggling to remember where the notes were. He was hearing the music in his head and letting his fingers translate it instantly. The music itself was alive. It swung and swayed, filled with a bluesy feeling that was surprisingly mature. It was happy, but with a hint of sadness underneath, a complexity that made you want to close your eyes and listen. The boy was swaying his body back and forth, keeping time with the rhythm. His small frame rocked with the force of the music, his head bobbing slightly to the beat. He was lost in it, completely transported to a different place. The silence of the crowd was broken only by the music. The screech of the trains arriving and departing seemed to fade into the background, unimportant noise compared to the melody echoing off the tiled walls. People standing at the back of the crowd stood on their tiptoes, craning their necks to see the source of the sound. Most of them wore expressions of pure disbelief. They looked at the boy's small school uniform, his scuffed sneakers and his dangling legs, and then they looked at the piano. Unable to reconcile the two, a woman near the front put her hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't just because the music was beautiful. It was because it was unexpected. In a world where everyone rushed and ignored each other, this moment of pure, unadulterated talent breaking through the gray routine was overwhelming. It felt like a gift. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He had played music for a living, for money, and for survival, but looking at this boy, he remembered what it felt like to play for love. He saw the joy on the boy's face, the way his eyes closed when he hit a particularly high note, savoring the sound. This wasn't a performance for an audience. This was a conversation between the boy and the instrument. The fact that 50 people were now watching him didn't seem to matter one bit. The tempo increased. The boy's hands became a blur, moving so fast that they looked like little birds fluttering over the keys. The rhythm became intricate, bouncing and syncopated. It was a difficult, high-speed run that would have made Julian's own hands cramp up, but the boy played it without a single mistake. The clarity of each note was perfect. The power behind the sound was surprising, coming from such a small person. He was attacking the keys with passion, but with total control. People who had been recording videos on their phones with mocking smiles were now holding their devices up with shaking hands, capturing history. They knew they were seeing something special. This wasn't just a cute kid playing. This was a prodigy in the wild, raw, and unpolished, but possessing more natural talent than most polished performers. The song built toward a climax. The chords became bigger, filling the entire station with sound. The rhythm drove harder, insistent, and loud. The boy was putting his whole body into it now, lifting off the bench slightly with the force of his playing. The energy was electric. The air around the piano seemed to buzz with it. Julian found himself holding his breath, his heart pounding in sync with the boy's rhythm. He felt a strange mix of humility and awe. He had judged the book by the cover, and the book had turned out to be a masterpiece. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rush of music slowed. The boy's hands moved toward the center of the keyboard. He played a final, complex run that cascaded down the scale like water falling over rocks, ending with a loud, decisive chord that rang out clearly through the station. Bang, the boy struck the final chord, and immediately dampened the strings with his other hand, cutting the sound off into a sudden, sharp silence. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The silence was heavier and louder than the noise had been. It was the silence of 100 people realizing they had just witnessed a miracle. The boy sat on the bench, panting slightly, his chest rising and falling. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands as if surprised they were his own. Then the shock broke. The applause wasn't just polite clapping. It was an explosion of sound. A roar went up from the crowd, whistling and cheering, bouncing off the subway walls. The businessman dropped his briefcase to clap harder. The teenagers were shouting, "Go, man, go!" The woman who had cried was wiping her eyes, a huge smile on her face. Julian just stood there, his arms hanging limp at his sides. He looked at the boy, who was now blushing bright red, seemingly overwhelmed by the noise of the crowd. The pianist looked down at his own weathered hands, then back at the child. The shock was settling into a deep realization. The boy hadn't just played a song. He had played a truth that Julian had forgotten. The music didn't care who you were, where you came from, or how old you were. It just was. And this boy, this nameless child in a worn uniform, was a master. The applause washed over the station like a wave, crashing against the tiled walls and filling the underground cavern with a sound that was usually reserved for sold-out concerts. The boy, still sitting on the high bench, looked smaller than ever amidst the roar of the crowd. His face, which had been so fierce and concentrated while playing, was now flushed a deep shade of pink. He seemed to shrink into his school uniform, shy and overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He wasn't used to this. He was used to being invisible, just like Julian. Julian stood frozen for a moment longer, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He looked at the empty seat next to him, then at the crowd whose eyes were now fixed on the child. The dynamic had shifted completely in just 3 minutes. The professional musician, the man who had spent his life practicing scales and studying theory, had just been outplayed by a 7-year-old boy with scuffed shoes. It was a humbling moment, but it wasn't a bitter feeling. Instead, Julian felt a strange lightness in his chest, a sense of wonder that he hadn't felt in years. He stepped forward, the crowd parting for him, and leaned down toward the boy. The noise quieted slightly as people leaned in to hear. "Hey," Julian said softly, his voice filled with genuine awe. That was incredible." The boy looked up, his big brown eyes wide. He managed a tiny, shy smile. "Thank you," he whispered. Julian wanted to know. He needed to know. He looked at the boy's hands again. How could such small hands produce that sound? "Who is your teacher?" Julian asked. "Where do you take lessons? Is your teacher here?" The crowd waited for the answer. They expected the boy to point to a proud parent standing in the back, or to name a famous music school in the city. They expected this to be a story about privilege and expensive tutoring, but the boy just shook his head. He looked confused by the question. "I don't have a teacher," he said simply. Julian blinked. "You taught yourself?" He couldn't believe it. The technique, the rhythm, the complex chords, it was impossible to learn all that without guidance. "Not really," the boy said, looking down at his sneakers. "I watch videos on the internet. On my mom's phone. I watch people play, and I copy what their hands do." Julian stared at him. Self-taught? It was rare, but it happened. But there was still the question of practice. "And do you have a piano at home?" Julian asked. "A keyboard?" The boy hesitated. He looked embarrassed. He kicked his foot against the leg of the piano bench. "No," he said, his voice so quiet that Julian had to lean closer. "We don't have space for a piano, and they cost too much money." The silence that fell over the group of listeners was heavy. They looked at the boy, trying to piece together the mystery. If he didn't have a teacher and he didn't have a piano, how did he do it? "Then how do you practice?" Julian asked gently. The boy held up his right hand. He looked at his own fingers, flexing them slightly. "I have a paper keyboard," he explained. "My dad drew it for me. He used a black marker to make the keys on a big piece of paper. I put it on the kitchen table. I practice on that every day after school. I try to imagine the sound in my head." Julian felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He looked at the boy's fingers that had danced across this real grand piano with such power, yet usually only tapped on a piece of paper. This boy had learned to create magic on a drawing. He had trained his muscles and his mind without ever hearing the notes he was playing, except through a tiny phone speaker. It was a level of dedication, of pure, stubborn love for music that Julian had never seen before. Julian looked at the open piano case sitting on the floor. It held a few crumpled dollar bills and a small pile of coins. It was his rent money, his food money for the next few days. But suddenly, looking at the boy, it felt like the most meaningless pile of trash compared to the gift the boy had just given the world. "You have a gift, kid," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. "A real, rare gift. Don't ever stop playing, even on the paper." He reached down and picked up the plastic case. He scooped out every single coin and bill. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything he had earned that day. He took the boy's small, rough hand and poured the money into it. The boy tried to pull back. "No, I can't," he stammered, shaking his head. "It's your money. You earned it." Julian closed the boy's fingers over the cash, squeezing his hand firmly. "I didn't earn this," Julian said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "You earned this. You played today. I was just the audience. Take it. Buy yourself some music books or save it for a real keyboard someday. This belongs to a musician." Tears welled up in the boy's eyes. He looked at the money in his hand, then up at Julian. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice cracking. At that moment, a woman stepped out of the crowd. She looked tired, wearing a cleaning uniform and carrying a heavy tote bag. She had been standing at the back, watching with her hand over her mouth. It was the boy's mother. She rushed over, her eyes wide as she saw the money in her son's hand. "Oh, no, sir, you don't have to do that," she said quickly, looking flustered. "I'm sorry if he bothered you. He just loves the piano so much." "He didn't bother me," Julian said firmly, looking her in the eye. He played better than I ever could. He deserves this. The mother looked at Julian, then at her son, and her expression softened into pure pride. She put her arm around the boy's shoulders. "Come on, sweetheart," she said gently. "Let's let this gentleman get back to his playing." The boy hopped off the bench. He stood for one last second, looking at the piano keys as if saying goodbye to a best friend. Then he turned and slipped away into the crowd, holding his mother's hand and clutching the money tightly. The commuters, who had stopped to watch, slowly parted to let them through. Many of them were smiling, some were still wiping away tears, and all of them carried a little bit of the magic they had just witnessed. Julian watched them go until they disappeared up the escalator. The station was returning to normal. The train screeched again, and the announcements started up. The bubble of silence had burst. The river of people began to rush again, heading to their homes and their dinners. Julian sat back down on the bench. It felt different now. The wood felt harder, and the air felt colder, but his heart felt warm. He looked at the keys. For weeks, he had been playing out of habit, playing because he needed to survive. He had forgotten the joy. He had forgotten the miracle of being able to make something out of nothing. He placed his hands on the keys, but he didn't play Beethoven this time. He closed his eyes and tried to hear the music the way the boy heard it in his head, pure, simple, and full of hope. He began to play a melody, soft and sweet. It wasn't a masterpiece, and the crowd rushed past him, ignoring him again. But that was okay. Julian wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing because he had been reminded that music isn't about the instrument, the stage, or the money. It's about what's in your heart. And thanks to a boy with paper keys, Julian had found his heart again.